He believed that trust was the most dangerous lie ever invented, but the sky was about to prove him wrong. The first sound Naomi Brooks remembered was not the screaming wind or the violent shudder of twisted metal. It was the quiet click of a stranger's seat belt releasing somewhere behind her as darkness swallowed the cabin. Then came silence, so complete it felt unreal, broken only by the distant crackle of burning debris and the steady whisper of snow drifting across shattered steel. Naomi opened her eyes to a world turned upside down. White snow covered the mountains in every direction, stretching farther than she could see beneath a pale winter sky. Her head throbbed, her left shoulder ached, and freezing air cut through the torn fabric of her uniform. She struggled to breathe as she pushed herself free from broken luggage scattered across the icy ground. Every movement felt heavier than the last, yet she forced herself forward, calling into the endless silence. "Is anyone there?" Her voice disappeared into the mountains without an answer. Fear settled deep inside her chest, but she refused to stop searching. She stepped carefully around torn seats and scattered belongings, praying that someone, anyone, had survived the impossible fall. Then she saw him. A man dressed in a charcoal overcoat lay against the remains of the aircraft's fuselage, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Even covered in frost, Damien Castellano carried the unmistakable presence of someone who had spent his entire life giving orders instead of receiving them. His expensive watch had stopped. A thin layer of snow rested across his dark hair, and his pale face had lost none of its sharp authority. Naomi recognized him instantly. Every employee inside the Castellano estate knew the man they were expected to avoid, the quiet owner whose reputation traveled through whispered conversations and nervous glances. She had worked inside his mansion for only 6 weeks, cleaning rooms he rarely entered while making every effort to remain invisible. She doubted he even knew her name. Kneeling beside him, Naomi hesitated for only a second before brushing the snow away from his shoulders. "Mr. Castellano," she called softly. His eyes opened with startling focus, cold gray meeting warm brown in a single sharp glance. He studied his surroundings without panic, taking in the broken aircraft, the endless mountains, and finally the woman beside him. "How many survived?" he asked, his voice calm despite everything around them. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. I haven't found anyone else." Damien slowly stood, ignoring the stiffness in his body, his gaze sweeping across the frozen landscape with calculated precision. There was no anger, no fear, only quiet calculation. After a long silence, he looked back at Naomi. "Then listen carefully," he said, his voice steady enough to silence the wind itself. "If we make one mistake out here, neither of us goes home." Naomi swallowed hard, clutching her torn coat against the bitter cold as snow continued to fall between them. Somewhere beyond the endless white mountains, the world believed they had disappeared forever. But neither of them understood that surviving the crash would become the easiest part of the journey waiting ahead. The wind grew sharper as daylight slowly faded behind heavy gray clouds, carrying with it a cold that settled into Naomi Brooks's bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ignore the sting in her fingers while Damien Castellano examined the mountains surrounding them. He did not waste a single movement. Every glance measured distance. Every breath seemed calculated. Naomi realized that even in the middle of nowhere, he carried himself like a man who expected the world to obey him. "We need shelter before sunset," he said quietly. "The temperature will fall below 20 degrees. Naomi nodded without arguing. She had grown up learning that panic never solved anything. Her grandmother used to say that fear could cloud a person's eyes, but kindness always helped them see the next step. She held on to that lesson now. Together, they searched through the scattered remains of the aircraft, collecting anything that might help them survive the night. A wool blanket, 2 unopened bottles of water, a small emergency flashlight, a package of crackers crushed beneath a seat cushion. Naomi carefully folded everything into a canvas travel bag, while Damien inspected a damaged emergency kit. He found a lighter, several chemical hand warmers, and a compact first aid pouch. "Good," he murmured. "This gives us a chance." Naomi noticed him press one hand against his side before quickly lowering it. He was trying to hide his discomfort. She pretended not to notice. Pride was written into every line of his face. and she sensed he would rather face a snowstorm than admit weakness. As they climbed away from the crash site, the snow became deeper, nearly reaching Naomi's knees in some places. The climb exhausted her, but Damien never slowed his pace. Eventually, they reached a narrow rock formation where the mountain blocked most of the wind. A shallow opening beneath the stone offered just enough space to escape the freezing air. Damien immediately began arranging branches and broken wooden panels carried from the wreckage, while Naomi gathered dry pine needles hidden beneath the snow. Working together happened naturally, even though neither of them spoke very much. The small fire finally came alive with a gentle orange glow, filling the shelter with welcome warmth. Naomi stretched her hands toward the flames, quietly thanking God under her breath. Damien looked at her for a brief moment, but said nothing. Instead, he handed her one of the unopened water bottles. "Drink first," he said. "You have been doing most of the walking." Naomi blinked with surprise before accepting it. "Thank you." They divided the crackers carefully, eating in silence while the wind howled outside. After several minutes, Damien finally broke the quiet. "How long have you worked at my estate?" Naomi hesitated. "Almost 6 weeks. I do not remember seeing you." She smiled softly. "That usually means I was doing my job well." For the first time since waking in the snow, the corner of Damien's mouth moved ever so slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was enough to soften the hard expression that had made so many people fear him. The moment disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Outside, snow continued falling, covering every trace of the crash. Inside the small shelter, two strangers from completely different worlds sat only a few feet apart, unaware that the frozen mountain was quietly stripping away every title, every wall, and every assumption they had ever carried about one another. Morning arrived without sunlight. Thick clouds covered the sky, turning the endless mountains into shades of white and gray that blended together until the horizon disappeared. Naomi Brooks woke first, feeding a few dry branches into the fading fire before quietly stepping outside the shelter. The cold bit at her cheeks immediately, but she ignored it, searching for anything useful hidden beneath the fresh snow. A cluster of evergreen trees stood several hundred feet away, their dark branches breaking the endless blanket of white. She remembered reading that snow collected beneath dense pines often melted more easily, offering clean drinking water. Filling both bottles with packed snow, she returned just as Damien Castellano opened his eyes. He sat up slowly, careful not to reveal the stiffness that had settled into his body overnight. Naomi handed him one bottle without saying a word. He accepted it with a brief nod before noticing that her gloves were missing. "Where are your gloves?" he asked. Naomi looked at her reddened hands and smiled faintly. "I used them to wrap the bottles so they would not freeze as quickly." Damien stared at the worn wool gloves covering the supplies instead of her hands. He removed his expensive leather gloves and held them toward her. "Take these." Naomi immediately shook her head. "No, sir. You need them more than I do." That was not a request. His voice remained calm, but something had changed. It no longer sounded like an order given to an employee. It sounded like concern disguised as authority. After a moment, she accepted them quietly. They were far too large, yet they held the warmth of another human being, and somehow that mattered more than the leather itself. Their journey continued through the forest, each careful step leaving deep prints in untouched snow. Damien constantly searched the terrain, looking for higher ground where rescue aircraft might eventually spot them. Naomi searched for simpler things: broken branches for firewood, animal tracks that might lead to water, patches of berries buried beneath frost. Together, their different instincts slowly formed an unexpected partnership. Around noon, Naomi noticed Damien pause beside a fallen tree. His breathing had become heavier than before, and one hand rested briefly against his side before dropping again. She pretended to focus on gathering wood until he began walking once more. Several minutes later, he stumbled on an icy slope, catching himself against a nearby rock before falling. Naomi hurried to his side. "Please sit down," she said gently. "You need to rest. We do not have time. If you collapse, we lose more time." Damien looked directly into her eyes. For the first time, there was no invisible distance between employer and employee. Only two exhausted people trying to survive another day. Without another word, he lowered himself onto a fallen log. Naomi carefully opened the small first aid kit. Beneath his coat, she discovered a deep bruise spreading across his ribs where the seat belt had protected him during the crash. She cleaned the area as gently as possible, saying very little. Damien watched her steady hands with quiet curiosity. "You have done this before," he said. Naomi nodded. "My mother worked 2 jobs. Whenever she came home exhausted, I learned how to care for her. Sometimes love looks very ordinary." Those words lingered in the cold mountain air long after neither of them spoke again. Damien looked toward the endless snowfields stretching across the wilderness, then back at Naomi as though seeing her for the very first time. Somewhere inside the silence surrounding them, the walls he had spent a lifetime building began to crack, not because someone had challenged his strength, but because someone had offered kindness without asking for anything in return. The 4th morning greeted them with a sky the color of steel and a silence so complete that Naomi Brooks could hear every snowflake settling onto the frozen earth. The fire had nearly burned itself out during the night, leaving only glowing embers beneath a blanket of gray ash. She quietly added the last of the dry branches they had collected the day before, watching thin ribbons of smoke rise into the cold air. Damien Castellano stepped outside the shelter and studied the mountains without speaking. His sharp eyes searched every ridge and valley as though determination alone could reveal a way home. After several minutes, he pointed toward a distant slope where the forest seemed thinner. "If rescue teams are searching from the air, higher ground gives us the best chance of being seen." Naomi looked at the steep climb ahead, then back at their nearly empty supplies. Only a few crackers remained, along with 1 bottle of water. Without saying anything, she quietly broke the last crackers into 2 uneven portions and handed the larger piece to Damien. He frowned immediately. "You kept the smaller one." Naomi smiled as though it meant nothing. "You need your strength more than I do." Damien did not take the food. Instead, he broke his portion in half and returned it to her. "We survived together or not at all." She looked at him with quiet surprise. The man she had known inside the mansion would never have shared anything. There, every conversation had been measured, every expression carefully hidden behind walls that seemed impossible to cross. Out here, the mountains were slowly stripping those walls away one silent day at a time. They continued climbing through waist-deep snow, using fallen branches as walking sticks to steady themselves against the slippery ground. The wind pushed harder with every passing hour, carrying tiny crystals of ice that sparkled like glass beneath the pale daylight. Naomi's breathing became heavier, but she refused to complain. She noticed fresh animal tracks crossing the snow and carefully followed them until she discovered a narrow stream flowing beneath a layer of clear ice. Kneeling carefully, she filled both bottles before calling Damien over. He watched her with growing respect. "You notice things most people miss," he said. Naomi laughed softly. "Cleaning houses teaches you that small details matter. A tiny stain becomes a permanent one if nobody notices it soon enough." Damien looked toward the stream, thoughtful. "Perhaps I spent too many years looking only at the biggest problems." They rested beneath a group of towering pine trees while snow drifted gently through the branches above them. For the first time since the crash, Damien removed the silver watch from his wrist and stared at its frozen hands. "My father gave me this when I was 21, he said quietly. "He told me that time belonged only to powerful people." Naomi listened without interrupting. After a long silence, she answered, "My grandmother used to tell me the opposite. She said time humbles everyone eventually, and what remains is how we treated the people beside us." Damien slowly closed his hand around the watch before slipping it into his coat pocket. He did not argue. He simply nodded once, as though her words had settled somewhere much deeper than either of them expected. When they finally reached the ridge just before sunset, the endless mountain range stretched beneath them like an ocean of snow. There were still no roads, no cabins, and no sign of rescue. Yet for reasons neither of them fully understood, the loneliness no longer felt quite as overwhelming as it had the day before, because each had quietly become the other person's greatest reason to keep walking. By the 5th day, the mountains no longer felt like strangers. Every ridge, every frozen pine, and every whisper of the wind had become part of a quiet routine that neither Naomi Brooks nor Damien Castellano had planned, but both had accepted. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time, scattering pale golden light across the snow until the entire valley shimmered like glass. Naomi stood near the edge of the ridge, lifting her face toward the warmth, however faint it was. I almost forgot what sunshine felt like, she whispered. Damien watched her from several feet away. It surprised him how someone with so little could still find reasons to smile. Most people he knew measured happiness by wealth, influence, or control. Naomi seemed to measure it by a sunrise and a few minutes without freezing wind. As they continued walking along the ridge, Damien noticed fresh, evergreen branches growing from a sheltered slope. Naomi carefully collected several handfuls of pine needles before filling one of the metal cups from the emergency kit with melted snow. She placed the needles into the steaming water over a small fire they managed to build between large rocks. "It is not coffee," she said with a quiet laugh, "but my grandmother always made pine needle tea when we were sick. She said warmth heals more than medicine sometimes." Damien accepted the cup after she handed it to him. The drink carried a clean woodland scent that reminded him of childhood winters long before power and responsibility had shaped every decision he made. He took another sip before looking at Naomi with quiet curiosity. "Your grandmother raised you?" Naomi nodded slowly. "After my father passed away, my mother worked almost every day. My grandmother taught me that kindness costs nothing, but it can change someone who has forgotten how to hope." Damien lowered his eyes to the steaming cup resting in his hands. "Hope was never discussed in my family. Survival was." The words lingered between them longer than either expected. Naomi did not respond immediately. She simply sat beside the fire, allowing silence to do what questions could not. Eventually Damien spoke again. "My father believed trusting people made you weak. He built walls around everything, including himself. When he died, I inherited more than his business. I inherited his fear." Naomi looked at him without judgment. "Fear can protect us for a while," she said gently. "But if we never let it go, it becomes another prison." Damien stared into the fire as the flames reflected in his gray eyes. No one had ever spoken to him that way before. Not because they lacked the courage, but because they always expected something from him. Money, protection, approval. Naomi asked for none of those things. She simply offered honesty wrapped in compassion. Later that afternoon, they discovered a fallen tree stretching across a narrow ravine, creating a natural bridge toward another ridge where the forest appeared thinner. Damien stepped forward first, then stopped halfway across. He turned and extended his hand toward Naomi without saying a word. She looked at him for only a second before placing her gloved hand in his. He guided her safely across the icy trunk with steady patience, releasing her only after both stood securely on the other side. Neither of them mentioned the moment, yet something invisible had changed. It was no longer a wealthy employer protecting an employee or a maid caring for an injured stranger. Somewhere between the snow-covered mountains and the endless quiet, two guarded hearts had begun learning that trust was not built through promises. It was built one small choice at a time. The weather changed without warning before noon. One moment the mountains rested beneath a quiet blue sky, and the next, thick clouds rolled across the peaks, swallowing the sunlight until everything around Naomi Brooks and Damien Castellano faded into shades of silver and white. The wind strengthened with every passing minute, carrying loose snow through the trees like drifting smoke. Damien stopped walking and looked toward the western ridge. "A storm is moving in," he said. "We need shelter before it reaches us." Naomi followed his gaze and noticed something else. A line of fresh footprints crossed the untouched snow several hundred feet ahead. They were larger than either of theirs and far too recent to belong to animals. She crouched beside them, brushing away loose powder with her gloved hand. "Someone has been here," she whispered. Damien examined the tracks in silence. "They are heading toward the lower valley." Naomi looked around uneasily. Could they be rescue workers? Damien slowly shook his head. If they are searching for survivors, they would be moving uphill toward the crash site, not away from it. His calm voice carried no panic, yet Naomi sensed a new alertness in every movement he made. Without another word, they turned toward a narrow group of evergreens where the thick branches offered better cover from the approaching storm. Snow began falling harder as they reached the shelter of the trees. The forest grew strangely quiet except for the steady whisper of wind passing through the needles overhead. Naomi gathered branches while Damien carefully arranged them against two large rocks, creating a barrier that blocked the strongest gusts. The small fire took longer to build than usual, but eventually a gentle flame pushed back the cold. As Naomi warmed her hands, faint voices drifted through the forest. They were distant, impossible to understand, but unmistakably human. Damien immediately extinguished part of the fire by covering it with loose snow until only a faint glow remained. Naomi looked at him with concern. "What if they are looking for us?" Damien answered without taking his eyes from the trees. "If they are, they will continue searching. If they are not, drawing attention could create unnecessary problems. We wait and observe." Naomi nodded, trusting his judgment even though uncertainty tightened her chest. They remained perfectly still as the voices faded once more into the wind. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before silence returned completely. Neither of them knew who had passed through the valley, but the encounter left an invisible weight hanging over the afternoon. When the snowfall finally softened, Damien stood and carefully adjusted the blanket around Naomi's shoulders after noticing she was shivering. She looked up, surprised by the quiet gesture. "You should keep it," she said softly. "You are still recovering." Damien met her eyes with an expression she had never seen inside the mansion. "You keep worrying about everyone except yourself." Naomi smiled gently. "Someone has to." He looked away toward the endless forest, thoughtful for a long moment before speaking again. "No," he said quietly. "From now on, someone will worry about you too." Naomi lowered her eyes, unsure how to answer. The words settled between them more warmly than the fire ever could. Beyond the trees, the storm continued drifting across the mountains, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they had appeared. While inside the small shelter, two lives continued changing in ways neither of them could have imagined only a few days before. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a sky so brilliantly clear that every distant peak stood sharp against the morning light. Naomi Brooks stepped out from beneath the shelter and paused in complete silence. Far across the valley, a faint trail of gray smoke curled upward into the blue sky. She blinked once, wondering if exhaustion had begun playing tricks on her eyes. Then she smiled. "Damien," she called softly, unable to hide the hope in her voice. "Look." He emerged from the shelter almost immediately, following the direction of her hand. His expression remained composed, but Naomi noticed the quiet spark that appeared in his gray eyes. "Someone is there," she whispered. "We are not alone anymore." Damien studied the distance carefully before nodding. "It is several miles away, but if the weather stays clear, we can reach that ridge before sunset." They packed everything they had left, leaving nothing behind except the ashes of the fires that had kept them alive. The climb was slow, yet every step felt lighter than the day before because, for the first time since the crash, they were walking toward possibility instead of uncertainty. Around midday, they reached an open slope where the snow had begun melting beneath the stronger sunlight. Naomi suddenly heard a distant mechanical sound carried by the wind. She stopped walking and listened carefully. Seconds later, Damien heard it too. A helicopter. Both of them looked toward the sky as the sound gradually grew louder. The aircraft appeared beyond the mountains, flying low enough to search the valleys below. Naomi instinctively waved both arms while Damien quickly added fresh pine branches onto a small fire they had built moments earlier. Thick white smoke drifted upward, twisting into the clear afternoon air. The helicopter circled once, then slowly turned toward their position. Naomi covered her face as tears filled her eyes. "They found us," she whispered. "They actually found us." Damien looked at the approaching aircraft without speaking. Relief settled quietly across his face, though it carried something else Naomi could not immediately understand. Within minutes, the rescue crew reached them, wrapping warm blankets around their shoulders and offering hot drinks that felt almost unreal after so many frozen nights. A medic gently checked Naomi's hands while another spoke with Damien nearby. Everyone smiled with the kind of joy reserved for impossible endings. Naomi looked back one final time at the mountains that had nearly become their final home. "I never thought I would miss this place," she admitted with a small laugh. Damien stood beside her, his eyes resting on the endless white landscape before turning toward her. "Neither did I." As the helicopter prepared for departure, Naomi stepped toward the open door, believing their strange journey had finally come to its natural end. She smiled warmly at Damien. "I suppose this is where our paths separate again." He remained silent for several seconds before answering in a voice quieter than she had ever heard. "No." Naomi looked at him, confused. Damien took one slow step closer, not with authority, but with unmistakable sincerity. "You are coming with me." The words caught her completely off guard. She searched his face, expecting to find the distant man she had first met inside the mansion. Instead, she saw someone changed by frozen nights, shared silence, and simple acts of kindness. Yet she still did not understand what he truly meant. And as the helicopter lifted above the mountains, the question lingered between them more powerfully than the roar of its turning blades. The helicopter landed on the private medical wing of the Castellano estate just before sunset, and for the first time in days Naomi Brooks felt solid ground beneath her feet instead of frozen snow. Doctors and staff hurried toward Damien Castellano, asking questions, checking his condition, and offering assistance he accepted with little more than a quiet nod. Naomi stepped back, believing her place in the story had finally come to an end. She waited until the medical team finished before approaching him with a gentle smile. "I am glad you made it home safely, sir." She extended the leather gloves he had given her in the mountains. "Thank you for helping me survive." Damien looked at the gloves, but made no effort to take them. "Keep them." Naomi hesitated. "I cannot." "Yes, you can." His voice remained calm, but there was a warmth hidden beneath the familiar confidence. "They belong to you now." She lowered her eyes for a moment before placing the gloves carefully inside her bag. "Then I should go? My aunt has probably been worried sick." She turned toward the front entrance, expecting nothing more than a quiet goodbye. "Naomi." She stopped immediately. Damien rarely spoke her name, yet hearing it now felt completely different from hearing an order inside the mansion weeks earlier. She faced him again. "Do not leave." The words were soft enough that only she could hear them. Naomi searched his face with quiet confusion. "I do not understand." Damien dismissed everyone else with a single glance. Within moments, the hallway became almost empty, leaving only the two of them standing beneath the warm evening lights. He took a slow breath before speaking, something she had never seen him do when making a decision. "When we were trapped in those mountains, I kept telling myself that I only needed to survive. I believed getting back here would solve everything." He looked around the enormous estate that had once represented absolute control over his life. "Instead, it made me realize how empty this place has always been." Naomi listened without interrupting. "Every person here respects my position," Damien continued quietly. "Many fear me. Many obey me. Very few know me. You never asked for my money. You never cared about my name. You cared whether I had eaten, whether I was warm enough, whether I could keep walking one more mile." His voice grew even softer. "No one has done that for me in longer than I can remember." Naomi folded her hands together, her expression gentle but steady. "Kindness should never depend on who someone is." Damien nodded slowly. "You taught me that." A long silence settled between them before Naomi finally answered. "But I cannot stay simply because we survived something difficult together. You are still the head of a powerful family. I am still the woman who cleaned your home. Those are two very different worlds." Instead of arguing, Damien accepted her words with surprising humility. "Then I will not ask you to stay because of gratitude." He met her eyes with complete honesty. "I am asking because I do not want to become the man I was before those mountains. If there is any chance of becoming someone better, I do not want to lose the person who showed me where to begin." Naomi felt her heart tighten, not from pressure, but from the sincerity she heard in every word. For the first time since returning home, she realized that Damien was no longer asking her to follow him. He was asking whether he could earn the privilege of walking beside her. 3 months passed, and the mountains slowly became a memory carried only in quiet moments. Spring returned to New York, filling the city with warm sunlight and the sound of life beginning again. Inside the Castellano estate, however, the greatest change had nothing to do with the season. Damien Castellano no longer spent every hour behind the closed doors of his private office. He walked through the halls without the invisible wall that had once separated him from everyone around him. He learned the names of the people who worked in his home. He thanked the cooks after dinner. He asked the gardeners about the flowers blooming near the entrance. The staff whispered to one another, wondering what had happened to the man who had once spoken only when necessary. Naomi Brooks noticed the changes as well, but she did not move back into the mansion. She accepted a new position instead, helping oversee the charitable foundation that Damien had quietly expanded after their return. Together, they created scholarships for children from working families, funded community programs, and restored shelters that had long been forgotten. Whenever reporters asked Damien why he had suddenly become interested in projects that brought him no financial return, he simply smiled and changed the subject. The truth belonged to two people and a lonely mountain that would never tell its secrets. One quiet afternoon, Naomi stood beside the large windows of the foundation office, watching children laugh in the park across the street. Damien entered carrying 2 cups of coffee, remembering exactly how she liked hers, with a little cream and no sugar. He handed one to her before standing beside her in comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked softly. Naomi smiled as she looked toward the bright spring sky. "Not because I miss being cold," she answered with a gentle laugh. "But sometimes I miss how honest everything became out there. There were no titles, no expectations, just 2 people trying to make it through another day." Damien nodded slowly. "I think about it too." After a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the silver watch that had stopped the moment the airplane crashed. He had never repaired it. Instead, he had placed it inside a simple wooden frame along with a photograph of the snow-covered mountains taken during the rescue investigation. He held it toward Naomi. "My father believed this watch represented power," he said quietly. "Now it reminds me that my life truly began the day time stopped." Naomi looked at the frozen hands resting beneath the glass and felt tears warm her eyes. She was not crying for the fear they had survived. She was grateful for the people they had become afterward. Damien turned toward her, his expression calm and completely open. "I promised myself I would never ask you to stay because of obligation." He paused before continuing. "So today I am asking something much simpler. Will you keep choosing this life with me, one ordinary day at a time?" Naomi reached for his hand, not because he was powerful, not because he was wealthy, but because he had earned her trust through patience, humility, and quiet change. She smiled with the same warmth that had once carried them through endless snow. "Yes," she answered. Outside, the afternoon sun poured across the city, touching every rooftop with golden light, and somewhere beyond the distant horizon the silent mountains remained exactly as they had always been, keeping forever the place where fear slowly gave way to hope, where kindness transformed a guarded heart, and where 2 completely different worlds discovered that the strongest bond was never built through power, but through dignity freely given. And that day, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.